Welcome to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills needed for building positive relationships with others. On one of our previous shows, we explained something called the cycle of conflict, in which all of us can get involved actually and get stuck in, and this cycle just seems to be self-defeating. Today's show is going to be about how to break free of that cycle and the skills that are needed to do that. So how do we break the cycle, and what skills do we need for that? That will be our topic for now.
So for those of you who did not see our previous show on the conflict cycle, and to refresh the memories of those who did, we'll briefly review the 4 steps of the conflict cycle for you.
Okay, so we're going to start here with these circles, and we're going to use a situation where we have 2 dating partners, Vanessa and George. Now, Vanessa has just recently started to date George, and she has thought it would be very nice to invite him over for dinner and to prepare a very nice meal for him, which she has done. So they are finishing their dinner, and afterward, George gets up from the table, and without saying anything to Vanessa about how he appreciated the dinner or how he felt about it, he walks right into her living room and sits down in front of her oversized TV set and watches football. This action becomes a triggering event for Vanessa. She begins to feel angry, annoyed, a bit discounted for all the effort that she's put into making this dinner. And she begins to think, what is this guy like? How insensitive. How could he do this to me? And now she has to put these feelings and these thoughts into an action that will represent those feelings and those thoughts. So she begins to stomp around the kitchen and to bang the pots and pans and the plates that she's cleaning up to let him know that she is very annoyed. That banging around in the kitchen is becoming George's triggering event. And he begins to have feelings of annoyance, and he begins to think, what is with her? Why is she making so much noise, and what's the big deal? And now he has to put these feelings and actions, or thoughts into action. And so he decides that he's going to yell out to her, hey, Vanessa, will you cut it back in the kitchen there? A little bit noisy. I can't even hear the refs and the calls they're making. Well, this just infuriates Vanessa. So this becomes another triggering event for her. She is more angry than ever, and she is beginning to think to herself, I don't even want to have anything to do with this guy. I can't believe his arrogance with it. I don't want to be around him. So she turns this into an action, marches right into the living room, and says, get out. I don't want anything to do with you. And this becomes now the triggering event for him. He becomes angry, confused, thinking, this woman is psycho. And then he gets up and starts to leave. And of course, he can't resist the temptation to say to her, you really ought to get a psychiatric evaluation. That in turn becomes another triggering event for her, and we start in again. But by this time, he has left. So Vanessa sits at the table and finishes off the wine in the bottle that's left. So that briefly is how the cycle of conflict works.
Yeah. Or she shoots off a text. Or
Right.
I've certainly
maybe
banged
him, maybe a friend.
my share of dishes and cabinets in the kitchen when I really wanted to say something but didn't know how to.
Right, yes. So people get stuck, as you can see. They get stuck in this cycle, and they don't know how to get out of it. So many things could have changed there, but it becomes a motivation of, me against you, and I'm right and you're wrong, and that is what tends to happen when you're stuck in that cycle. So the actions and the words of each person turn into a retaliating action against the other person. So resolution of the conflict, obviously, in this, if you don't break that cycle, is very unlikely under these types of conditions. And then you have residual feelings of anger and resentment. Sometimes revenge is common in these scenarios, but these are things that people, those feelings last for a long time to come, not just in that moment. So, Marsha, you're going to talk about some common thinking patterns that keep us stuck in that conflict.
There are different categories that are listed in a book that Tom's come across recently called Seeking Soulmate, and the author's last name is Ajjan, A-J-J-A-N. We may recognize ourselves in some of these categories, but not known what the label was. But mind reading might be something that keeps us stuck, because this is what happens when we are convinced that we know exactly what the other person was thinking, feeling, and why they behave that way, without checking in. We make assumptions, we act on those assumptions, and that'll keep us stuck in this conflict. Should statements. We all carry around these collection of how we think the world should operate and how we should behave. And when somebody invalidates one of our should statements, like you should always write a thank you note, or you should always be on time, or whatever the collection of rules that we have, if somebody breaks that, then we could stay stuck.
And sometimes even in mediation, we'll see one person say to the other, this is what you should do.
Right,
yes.
exactly.
And that doesn't go across well either.
Even if it's not an objective constant, they do, even situationally, they know what you should do.
Yes.
Because that is what would fix everything. Is
exactly.
If you do what I say you should do.
And I could see it clearly.
Would be okay.
Right. Black and white thinking. You know, it's all or one or the other can get us stuck. Catastrophic thinking. This is when you're focusing on the worst possible outcome. You're in the moment, but instead of looking at the cues that you're getting, you're projecting into the future of what could be this catastrophic outcome. Discounting positive information. This is something that we're all prone to. If you've got a feeling about somebody in conflict, you may set aside the stuff that contradicts your feelings about them. You minimize it. Overgeneralizing, making connections when there really aren't connections, or you know somebody who was in the same situation, and so therefore this situation is going to be just like it.
And we hear that in mediation all the time, right?
Yeah.
Well, this judge decided this, and this person did this, and this family did that.
My brother-in-law.
Exactly. When they were in this situation.
Never treated.
Right.
With it, and I know I'm going to get the same treatment.
Exactly. So yes, overgeneralizing in that sense happens a lot.
Or even situations that two conflicting partners are having, where they make a leap of faith between one thing that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other. Emotional reasoning, when that feeling becomes true because you're having the feeling. If I feel that this must be happening, then it must be so.
And there's no other explanation for that other than
it's true because I feel it.
Yes.
What ifing, like wondering and worrying about what could happen, again, instead of being in the moment and being present with what's happening. A little different than catastrophic, because it's just constantly wondering.
And you're thinking of all the different outcomes that could happen.
And that can be paralyzing, and you could get stuck in this cycle. And last but not least, labeling and judging. And this kind of cycles back to the mind reading, when you make assumptions without checking in. And we're just as human beings, when we don't have information, you fill in information, you make assumptions and if you're in conflict with somebody, you may not be likely to check in with them because you're having difficult conversations. You don't want to have extended conversations to get more information. And we're much less charitable to others than we are to ourselves. Someone could behave the exact same way that we do in a situation, but we'll make excuses because of external factors that made us behave that way. Yet, when we see it into someone else, we attribute it to their core values, and they're that way because they're internally that way. And that's the labeling that'll get us into trouble.
Well, and the labeling, too, has that when someone talks about the label, the person is then that label.
They're lazy,
So,
they're irresponsible, they're
so
late.
if I'm
they're-
narcissistic, that doesn't mean necessarily that at the moment I'm being selfish. It means you are that kind of label,
Right.
which is highly detrimental to any type of conflict resolution.
Right.
with
So beyond
that
the
assumption.
a particular behavior in a moment, it's generalized to the person's character.
And like you said, we make those assumptions, and when we make those assumptions, they become true and real for us without checking in with the other person, because we already know they're true.
And we
so
act
there's
on
nothing
it.
to check on.
Yes.
We act on it.
It keeps the cycle going
Yeah.
because I know what you are.
Exactly.
So how could it be anything different?
Exactly.
So how can we break this cycle?
So now that we kind of know the ways that we get stuck in the cycle of conflict, how do we break that cycle? What can we do to pull ourselves out of it and still continue a strong relationship with the other person? Because that often is the goal, is to continue a relationship with somebody, and we don't want to break that. But so how do we do that? Daniel Dana, who is a noted expert in the field of mediation, and he's the author of Managing Differences. So what he says is, in order to break that conflict cycle, one of the parties must make what he calls a conciliatory gesture toward the other. And Marsha, you're going to talk about those in just a minute, but a conciliatory gesture is some type of behavior that signals to the other person a change from that me against you mentality, and it turns it into an us against the problem. So we're trying to problem solve. We together are trying to problem solve. This could be in the form of a verbal statement, it could be a change of attitude, it could be a respectful question, anything that suggests more interest in the solution part of the problem than continuing the fighting part of the problem. So this gesture kind of interrupts the conflict cycle, and then it moves the interaction more toward the relaxation of tension, letting that go a little bit and having a respectful discussion, sharing points of view, that we've talked about points of view quite a bit in this show before, working creatively towards a solution that is mutually satisfactory instead of coming up with something that just works for one or the other of us. So some examples of conciliatory gestures might be things such as...
Well, the obvious one is apologizing. And you may go around this circle a couple of times before you can get to this point. And sometimes people can be even tangled in it, thinking, how do we get out of this? But apologizing. But apologies are somewhat misunderstood, because some people use them very, very casually and say, well, I'm sorry, or I'm sorry, but you, or I'm sorry that you, and put it back on the other person.
I love the one that's always, oh, sorry about that.
Sorry about
and
that,
then
or
boom, we go right on to
or
something else.
sorry if.
Right.
Yes.
But you really have to
Or
be
sorry you're hurt.
sorry,
You know,
yeah.
even that is
Sorry you're hurt,
not-
or sorry you felt that way.
Sorry you felt that way.
Even in,
that's a big one.
business, you know, we'll see frequently a comment about, we apologize for any inconvenience this has caused you. But there's nothing more than that. It's a very non-committal way of apologizing, if that even.
Right.
Very generic as well.
Yeah.
So what a better apology, a true apology, needs to be is specific and genuine, with some description of a remedy or a restorative factor of the hurt or of the harm.
When I used to teach that to students, we would discuss that part of the apology, which was new to them, the kids hearing that. And we were talking about that you can use the phrase, what can I do to make this up to you? Or if that doesn't fit, a committed statement that I can promise you I will not do that again. So it's more than just sorry. There's a commitment, there's something that takes energy and commitment from the person making the apology that makes it more sincere.
And
There's
an
some
acknowledgement.
investment.
Yes,
an
investment.
acknowledgement and an investment.
Of
in
a
it.
contribution.
Yes. Right.
I contributed to this cycle of conflict, and I'm going to tell you what it is, and I'm going to ask to disrupt it. You know.
Yeah, and just for that person to admit it has a healing effect on the person who's hearing it and who's been wronged, if you want to look at it that way. And then to add to that, I want to make this up to you, or I want to do something for you, really makes it sound then in terms of.
Right, and if you can't get to that, granting exactly what the other person needs, you might be able to strike a compromise. Or at least say, I hear what you're saying, and that must feel awful, and kind of empathize with the other person. That may be, on the path to the apology.
Sometimes we don't recognize, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sometimes we don't recognize what our contribution was.
Yes.
And it is worth maybe discussing and
We don't
pointing
make
out.
contributions to conflict. It's always the other person's fault, right?
Or if you don't want to go all the way to an apology because you're really not feeling
there
that.
yet.
Yeah. And we always have said to people, do not apologize if you don't feel apologetic about it. That
Absolutely.
would come across as false. But sometimes we can express regret that these activities or what has happened has occurred. And that's not quite the same as an apology, but we're at least getting closer to that if that's needed. And the other person knows, well, at least I know you would have preferred that didn't happen.
Or you could, grant their request.
Right. There's I thought some interesting criteria that we came across, which is the step here on conceding is another word for the same thing with it. And when do you know that it's good to concede or no? Stick up for what you think is important with it. And of course, the final feeling, I guess, is how you feel when you come out of it. If you feel used, feel still that you're being taken advantage of, then the approach you're using probably isn't effective.
Or,
but here's sort
or
of
authentic.
or authentic, yeah. But I thought it was interesting here if what you are looking for is really of low interest to you and of low interest to the other person. It's not that big a deal. Why get into a dispute over that?
It's the old pick your battles.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Know which
sometimes
ones-
there's a hidden thing behind the alleged conflict that does make it really important to you. And then it's important to define what that is. So the conflict really isn't the conflict, it's something else behind that.
Right. And then,
with it.
and then it's no longer of low interest
Correct.
to you. But
Yes.
yes, initially, if it's of low interest to you and the other person, then, you can pick and choose your battles and say, forget it, this just
Right.
isn't worth getting into, unless it goes to that place.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the other one is it's low interest to you, but it's high interest to the other party. Again, why fight about that? If it's that important to you and it's not that important to me, let's do it.
And I think it's important to note that doesn't mean you just give in and say, forget it. Just never mind, do what you want. Because sometimes that is technically giving in and allowing the other person to, you're conceding and giving them what they want, but in a way that is not beneficial necessarily, that it's in a way that the conflict might still continue, as opposed to saying, you know what, make a conscious decision. This isn't that important to me. It's really okay if we go to such and such a restaurant tonight because it really doesn't matter to me that much, and it's really okay if we go there because I know it's important to you.
Right. That gets back to in the 6 styles of conflict resolution, which I think we've presented before, the accommodating.
Accommodating.
Right.
That, and when you do that in a loving gesture, and it isn't a major thing to you, you're more interested in
The relationship.
the
long-term.
relationship and the other person feeling good about it, that can be very good.
Right.
But then when there's a high interest in it for you in the resolution of this, but a low interest in that solution to someone else, that might be when you want to advocate pretty hard for what you want.
And not
with it.
concede.
And not concede, right.
And then the last one, of course, when it's of high interest to both parties, that's when the skills really come into play to determine what makes it so important to each person and to work with those issues.
Right. And going back to those collaborative efforts that we've mentioned in the previous shows, and having people get to the heart of what is important to them and working together to resolve something.
But at least if you're talking about the investment that each of you have in the topic, you've stopped throwing mud.
Yes.
And
It's
you're
already
actually
interrupted the cycle.
Yeah,
Yes.
it has, just by the virtue of saying, okay, let's stop and think about how important this is to each other. And I think we mentioned compromise.
And you want to define that again, just to make sure everybody understands that the compromise.
That you're giving up a little bit, maybe not getting it's a win-win situation, but you've both budged a little bit. I've given some, you've given some. We perceive that we've both leaned in, that I'm not going away with my position and you're not winning your position, where we've found a middle ground, so to speak. And then we were talking about empathy. I mean, you may still not be at the apology, you may not still be at the point where you're capitulating, but you can still understand. Okay, I understand where you're coming from, and maybe do some reflective listening that we've also talked about before. That can open up, and that can de-escalate just by the person feeling understood.
Yes.
You may not be seeing eye to eye yet, but it's like, okay, I guess I can see how you were feeling in that situation.
And just the gesture of that, even if you don't necessarily feel that the other person is really understanding you, the gesture of them trying to sympathize and empathize is helpful in and of itself.
And you're legitimizing their point of view.
Right.
You may still have your own point of view.
Well, there's a difference between empathizing and saying, if I were in your shoes, I think I might feel the same way.
Right.
But I have a different solution for it
I'm not
than
in your
what you said.
shoes. Right. This is how I'm
Right.
experiencing it
Yes.
instead. And you can disclose your own feelings about it. And all of these things invite the other person to do likewise.
It gets back to what we've talked before about when someone has a different perspective on something, to become curious and start asking the questions to find out, not in an interrogation way, but just to find out, I really would like to see this differently from what I am.
Help
Share
me understand.
More. Yeah.
That's,
I just read something recently, actually, that also talked about asking why at least 5 times in a conversation, and not the same why over and over again, but letting the why lead to other whys. So, why are you feeling this way? And if the person says, I'm feeling this way because, this happened or this happened. Oh, why did that happen? This happened because of this. Oh, why? And it leads to a greater understanding
on both people. Perhaps
Exactly.
that the first party who's answering the questions hasn't even thought of it that way.
Right. That's right.
And saw the
Gets clarification for them too.
And it's key to ask it in a way that is gathering information, not in an accusatory, annoying way. Right. Just information gathering.
If we want to look at our scenario with George and Vanessa, we might want to quickly go through some of the other things.
Okay.
We can ask for honest feedback. Say, okay, rather than saying, help me understand your point of view, give me some honest feedback about mine.
If George were to say, how did that come across when I sat down in the living room and watched TV? How did that come across to you? That would give her the opportunity then to say, it just sounded like you totally discounted all the work I put into this.
We can accept some personal responsibility. That's the,
If each George and Vanessa were to say, well, maybe I overreacted a little bit to that, or maybe I could have approached it differently instead of
And
banging
that's
pots
key,
and pans.
right? That's key. I think in that moment, people tend to feel like they only have that one option, so that's their reaction. However, if they take a moment and take a step back and say, I could have done this a little bit differently. What are the ways I could have approached this that may have been more useful? That's an eye-opening thing to do. Most people don't look at it that way.
Well, her assumption in this scenario was that he didn't care, that he didn't appreciate.
Right.
It might be that he feels so comfortable there that he feels like he's at home and that he can do this.
Could have been a positive.
Could have been a positive gesture and statement about their relationship, but it wasn't perceived that way.
And taking accountability for sharing her feelings with him, and just going out and saying the I message even, when we just had a dinner that I spent so much time working on because I really wanted it to be special for us, and you get up and walk into the living room and watch TV, I felt totally discounted for this thing. and I was angry with it. So that would have allowed him to then have,
Information.
didn't think about it that way.
Exactly.
I just was comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
About 4 minutes
So,
left.
So if we're going to look at conciliatory gestures, just recognize that they could be a little bit risky, right? Sometimes making one vulnerable to the situation.
And that's almost
And if
guaranteed to happen when you use conciliatory gesture,
Right.
that you're going to be vulnerable.
Right. So maybe even saying it out loud, because maybe it won't be recognized or respected by the other person, but you can point that out. But the alternative is staying in the conflict cycle, and that's not usually a good thing, and that usually will damage, I mean, especially in our scenario, it ended the relationship.
Yeah.
So it could be pretty damaging. But when it's successful, conciliatory gestures interrupt that cycle. And when that happens, it reduces the tension, it increases respect, and it increases trust and affection with the other person. So it's an important thing to try.
It's worth the risk.
It is
because
worth the risk.
the other way is pretty guaranteed that it's not going to come out well anyway.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
it should be noted that this same cycle can feed itself in a positive way.
Yes. Why don't you
With a
explain more of that? Yes.
conciliatory gesture, or a compliment, or a recognition of something positive,
Becomes a triggering
becomes a
event.
triggering event, which is like, wow, he or she noticed, thank you. And then you're going to behave differently in relationship to that person, which is a positive triggering event. So there's a momentum in either direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really key point, is to recognize that it can be a positive. Yeah.
Well, we hope that you have learned something new of value to use in your relationships with others from what we've presented today. And please give us your feedback on the show by writing us an email on the address that's indicated on the screen. We certainly look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.